His first mask was not made of gold. It was lined with rags to prevent the liquid oozing from his lower lip from dripping out. When the servants first removed the sheet from his face, at dawn, on the 19th day of May, they recoiled. His nose had collapsed, the skin separated from the skull like wet bark. One of the physicians, young and new, dropped the basin of salt water and rushed out of the bedchamber, trembling. The elders merely bowed their heads in silence and began the cleansing. 30 drops of vinegar, mint, and black resin. The king of Sicily, once handsome and warlike, now whispered that he saw an angel with a rat's mouth at the window bars. This beginning is not recorded in the official chronicles, but was reported through the testimony of the chamberlain Pietro Testa, taken in August of that year, after the sovereign's death. He claimed that from mid-spring onwards, the king no longer took off his armor, even in the midday heat. He slept in his armor, ate through a slit in his visor, and summoned his ministers in the dark. And when one of the pages carelessly looked into the crack of his helmet, he never spoke again and was soon found hanged in the garden. At the beginning of the year 1268, King Roger of Sicily was still able to ride through the harbor of Palermo. The crowd welcomed him, knowing that the Aragonese were again pushing south and the Sienese were rebelling. But even then, there were rumors that the smell of rotting flesh followed him. His horses were afraid of him. One of the officers of the guard complained that after his watch, his teeth fell out and his nails turned black. Soon, the king disappeared from public ceremonies altogether. The official version was that he had withdrawn to pray in the monastery of St. Erasmus. In reality, according to the testimony of a monk named Benedetto, who was summoned to the court, Roger lay on a black Kamchatka mat, wrapped up to his eyes, and constantly asked for melted honey to be dripped into his ears to drown out their whispers. The monk could not understand whom he meant, spirits or advisors. The medicine of the time, which consisted of evaporating the rotten bloodletting, proved powerless. Leprosy, judging by all the signs, that was what it was, covered his face and neck. His left eye had fallen out, and his upper eyelid had fused with his cheek. Touching the wounds caused bloody foam and fits of screaming. Nevertheless, orders continued to come out with his seal. Death sentences, army movements, exile of the nobility. As Count Bruno de Calta wrote in a private letter, "It is armor that rules now, not man." The intrigues intensified. The heir, Prince Filippo, tried to gain access to his father, but was turned back 3 times by the guards. The great chamber was sealed. At the same time, Chancellor Benevento increased the guard around the archives, fearing the theft of the will. The cardinals, previously divided between the Roman and Angevin factions, began secret meetings in the catacombs under the chapel of St. Agatha. Rumors spread throughout the city that the king had long been dead, and that a double wearing a helmet was on the throne. In reality, Roger was alive. He breathed through a tube fixed to his larynx and spoke with difficulty, mostly using signs. His body was losing function. First his legs, then his bladder. A doctor named Lamberto administered opium under his tongue, but by mid-June, even a triple dose didn't dull the pain. A report dated the 6th stated, "His Majesty is scratching the skin off his chest with his fingernails and asking that the devils be kept away from his bed. He ate only liquid food through a funnel. The skin on his forehead was covered with a crust, from which flakes the size of coins fell off. The rooms were lined with sandalwood-soaked cloth, but the stench could be smelled on the stairs. 2 maids fell ill and died, one from infection, the other from fear. Judging by the remains of notes found in a palace chest in the 20th century, in his last days, the king ordered his son's name to be removed from his will and appointed his younger sister, a nun in Monreale, as his heir. This document disappeared that same night. According to unofficial sources, Prince Filippo burned it himself. On June 25th, the king's body began to ooze a black liquid through the seams of his armor. When they finally decided to remove his helmet, his face appeared to be dried out from the inside. His forehead had sunken, his lips were cracked, and his tongue was black and swollen. One of the physicians, an elderly and blind man, silently crossed himself and left the chamber without waiting for an audience. Roger died during the night, without confession. His body was guarded by 40 soldiers. At dawn, it was carried out wrapped in shrouds, and then they tried to embalm it for hours, but his insides had already decomposed. His liver crumbled, and his intestines burst when they opened him up. According to the report of a monk who was a herbalist, the decay began at least 2 weeks ago, but was masked by cinnamon and laurel oil. The funeral was held in secret. Only courtiers and guards gathered in the square in front of the cathedral. The people were not allowed to attend. The ambassadors of Aragon and the papal see left the city before dawn. In the evening, 3 fires broke out in Palermo, supposedly accidental. But rumors persistently linked them to the new government. Prince Filippo began purging the nobility immediately after the funeral. Thus died he who fought against the Saracens, but could not defeat the worm in his cheek, wrote an anonymous chronicler of the monastery of St. Anthony. During the week after Roger of Sicily's death, none of his associates dared to utter the word leprosy aloud. However, the records of the court physician, Lamberto, made public decades later, contain the direct wording: decomposition caused by internal rot originating from the facial and cervical nodes, typical of the late stage of leprosy. Lamberto was executed in July on charges of witchcraft. His report was burned. After a secret funeral in the monastery of St. Erasmus, the sovereign's body remained in the cathedral until midnight. The coffin was not lifted from the floor. The monks complained of an unbearable smell and the fainting of 3 brothers. Only after the sarcophagus was filled with wax and the interior was oiled was the body transferred to the crypt. Witnesses mentioned that liquid was dripping from under the lid and that the skin on the king's forehead peeled off when touched, exposing bare bone. The political situation changed suddenly. Prince Filippo, who had previously been removed from the council, summoned the Archbishop of Palermo, 3 generals, and a judge within 24 hours of his father's death. Under threat of execution, he forced them to sign a new decree, appointing him regent in the absence of a capable monarch. The official coronation was postponed due to mourning, but all military powers had already been transferred to him. On the same day, 3 of the king's close associates were arrested: his valet, Pietro Testa, his herbalist brother Andrea, and his scribe, Lodovico. They were tortured in an internal prison under the arsenal. During interrogation by the captain of the guard, Tangredo, the valet stated that since spring, His Majesty had not spoken with his voice, but with a squeak, and whispered that his flesh was punishment for his pride. The scribe Lodovico confirmed that for the last month the king's signatures had been written by hand by a servant under duress. Meanwhile, panic broke out in the city. Rumors of the leprous king sparked an outbreak of violence. The bodies of beggars were found drowned in the canals. 2 Jews were burned at the castle gates for spoiling the springs, and 3 women were put in stocks as carriers of stench. The people refused to accept alms from the courtiers, fearing cursed money. At the insistence of the clergy, a purification service was held. 9 priests walked through the city with censers and salt, scattering herbs. Meanwhile, executions were taking place in the castle. 10 members of the former council were arrested and accused of participating in the conspiracy. Count Bruno de Calta was hanged, and his wife was drowned in a well. The decrees were signed personally by Philip and sealed with a new seal bearing the inscription, "For the salvation of the throne." One of the priests, Brother Marino, confessed under torture that during the last month before his death, the king had demanded that pages from ancient manuscripts containing spells be brought to him. He burned them in his room, saying that nothing but fire could purify his mind. According to the same brother, he once found Roger sitting on the floor surrounded by rats, which he was feeding the remains of his dinner. By this time, almost all of the king's staff had been replaced. Those who remained complained of a damp smell of rotting fish, mold on the stone, and a certain force that made their heads ache and their eyes darken. Doctors refused to enter without mass soaked in vinegar. At night, the maids placed fresh mint and garlic at the door. Embalmers, secretly hired from Naples, recorded that when the chest was opened, the heart broke apart at the first touch, and the tongue was elongated, swollen, and blackened. One of them fell ill a day after the procedure. The second disappeared, and his body was later found in a cistern outside the city, wrapped in bandages. Historians argue about whether Roger's illness was natural. According to one version, voiced in a later chronicle by the monk Bonaventure, the decomposition began with a wound inflicted during the last hunt. According to another, the cause was poison, allegedly injected into his ear through a stick with ointment. This version is supported by the words of Cardinal Arnaldo, recorded in his diary. He was punished not for his sins, but for his insolence against the throne of St. Peter. Against the backdrop of the collapse of power, tensions with the church intensified. The papal nuncio, who arrived in June, refused to meet with the king, citing the threat of infection. In a letter sent to Rome, he wrote, "Possession of this island may turn into a spiritual and physical curse for anyone who approaches it." Prince Filippo began to introduce new rules. He closed the monastic schools, forbade beggars from approaching the palace, and demanded that iron bars be installed on all the windows of the bishop's residence. A pedestal was erected in the square, on which every inhabitant had to swear allegiance to the new ruler. At the end of June, bodies began to disappear. First, 2 monks who served Roger, then one of the doctors and a clerk. At the site of their disappearance, they found burn marks, clothing remnants, and charred steps. No official explanation was given. Servants whispered that something had taken up residence in the castle, something that had come out of the old king's body. Tension continued to grow. The archbishop sent a letter to Rome demanding a church investigation. The pope refused. Regent Filippo issued a decree. Anyone who mentions the sovereign's illness will be considered an enemy of the throne. But the fear did not disappear. On the contrary, it deepened. A wave of suicides began. 2 young men from the guard, a cook and a priest from a monastery. One left a note. I heard him calling my name from the coffin, and the smell was back in the city. They tried to mask it with incense and smoke, but it seeped through. People said, "He's still here with us." In July, the heat over Sicily was thick like melted fat. The air above the Palazzo Reale in Palermo was still, and the palace walls cracked from the stifling heat. The shadows on the square in front of the cathedral grew longer. People no longer approached the temple. By that time, rumors about the true cause of King Roger's death had become impossible to contain. 3 monks from the Dominican order were arrested for preaching that God's punishment had already descended upon the throne. They were dragged from the cells at night, taken to the catacombs, and never returned. One of them, Brother John, left a message written in chalk on the wall before he disappeared. A man with the face of a leper cannot rule. Despite his formal burial, the king's coffin was not left in peace. On the 6th day after the funeral, it was moved. The reason was not specified. A brief note survives in the archives of the monastery of St. Erasmus. The sarcophagus was opened by order of the regent and moved at night, accompanied by 4 guards and 1 priest. The priest, Brother Aurelio, said under torture at the end of his life, his face was like a tree, but everything was bubbling inside. We carried him, and it dripped from below. He was empty, like a leather bag, but warm. Someone whispered that he was not dead. On the same day, a rumor spread throughout the city that breathing could be heard in the crypt. People began to gather in the square, demanding that the liturgy be repeated. Regent Filippo sent guards. 9 people were arrested and 1 was hacked to death. There was commotion inside the palace. Chancellor Benevento disappeared. They say he tried to escape to Messina, where an opposition group of nobles had already formed. He was found on the 3rd day, his throat slit with a pen in his own office. The papers were gone. Filippo, aware of the growing pressure, began to introduce harsh measures. In orders issued almost daily, he banned public discussion of the king's illness, restricted movement around the city after sunset, and increased patrols around monasteries. One decree prohibited any mention of rot, leprosy, ulcers, or a disfigured face in relation to the former monarch. However, even inside the castle, order began to break down. 2 cooks disappeared from the palace kitchen. The room where they cooked was boarded up. Rumor had it that they had gone blind and died from the unbearable stench, as if someone had put a sheep's head in boiling vinegar and thrown rotten eggs into it. The doctors, who remained at court, demanded to leave the capital. One, an old man named Guido, wrote in a note, "There is no life here. People breathe through their mouths. Even the birds do not land on the walls." He was found 2 days later. He had cut open his stomach. Fear grew in the castle. The servants refused to go near the south wing, where Roger's bedchamber had once been. The walls there were covered with stains. The stone was cracked. One soldier, assigned to night watch, lost his mind the next morning. He claimed to have seen a faceless man in armor walking down the corridor. From that moment on, the hunt for the possessed began. Servants who expressed doubts about the sacred origin of royal power disappeared. Several dwarfs who entertained the court were burned at the stake as carriers of the spirit of decay. The archbishop, who had previously remained silent, finally called for an exorcism of the palace in early August. He personally performed the ritual in the council chamber, but afterwards fell ill and did not get out of bed. He died 3 days later. His body decomposed twice as fast as normal. One of the monks said, "He breathed the air from the king's chambers, and his flesh no longer belonged to him." To make matters worse, there was unrest among the nobility. Two clans, the Orsini and Mellini families, began armed skirmishes in the suburbs. Murders took place in the streets. People said that they were not fighting for land, but for the right to close Roger's sarcophagus again. At the same time, reports of spots on the skin began to appear. Corpses with ulcers were found in the suburbs of Palermo. Some began to say that leprosy was no longer a disease but a punishment for sinful rule. Flagellants appeared. People walked barefoot, whipping themselves and repeating, "Forgive us for serving the Faceless One." Filippo began to lose control. His face was covered with a rash, and he forbade his image from being depicted on coins. He issued a decree ordering the entire court to move to the fortress of Trapani, but some of the nobility refused to follow. Some began secret negotiations with the queen, a nun and former sister of the late Roger. The palace was deserted. The windows were boarded up and the doors sealed with wax. The south wing was completely isolated, but even this did not help. Two envoys who had come from the Papal States fled without waiting for an audience. Their note read, "We saw how he walks, and there is no God in him." At that moment, panic broke out among the people. They stopped burying the dead. Faceless figures wrapped in armor were carried through the streets. People began to write in charcoal on the walls. "The king has returned. The rot will not go away. The face is a lie." And all this time, according to the testimony of one of the last pages, Roger's body, or what was left of it, was moved again. The sarcophagus was empty. No one knew where it had gone. Only Lodovico, the surviving scribe, later wrote in exile, "He did not go into the ground. His flesh does not accept death, and as long as it is here, nothing will change." On the 4th day of August, 1268, according to the official version, Prince Filippo was crowned Filippo Rifcho of Sicily. The ceremony took place without the people. The bells did not ring. The crown was placed in the hall of the Holy Cross behind closed doors. According to the captain of the guard, sweat broke out on his forehead and his hands were covered with spots. He crossed himself 3 times before standing up. Immediately afterwards, decrees were issued closing all monasteries within 7 leagues of the capital, confiscating all records of King Roger's death, and executing anyone who spread unholy rumors. The archives were sealed and the palace library was burned, and yet the destruction was already unstoppable. In the first days after the coronation, a mutiny broke out among the sailors in the harbor of Palermo. They refused to accept food consecrated by the spirit of the Faceless One. This was followed by a rebellion in Syracuse, where a group of nobles declared independence from the leprous crown. They were all slaughtered, but the rumors spread further, to Naples, to Genoa. The papal throne distanced itself. An official letter from the Pope stated, "The Sicilian court must be cleansed not only physically, but also spiritually." The papal legate was recalled, the remaining ambassadors left in silence. By this time, Roger's former sarcophagus had disappeared from the monastery. It was removed at night, without inscriptions, and taken deep into the island. One of the carters, later arrested for blasphemy, said, "We were carrying an empty coffin, but liquid was dripping from it." Another said that on the way he heard heavy breathing under the lid. Both were burned. Filippo became detached. He did not appear in public, ate only from silver dishes, and did not allow anyone to come closer than 3 steps. He changed his seal. Instead of a coat of arms, it was a shield without an image. It was said that he ordered a mask to be made for himself out of deerskin. Against the backdrop of political isolation, Sicily began to disintegrate. Trade came to a standstill. Spain cancelled agreements. Rotten ships lay in the harbor. Bishops refused to serve one after another. One of them, before retiring to a hermitage, wrote, "We have witnessed the transfer of power from man to the body." It was at this time that secret notes began to circulate, signed anonymously but written in style by one of the former courtiers. They said that King Roger was not dead, but had left his body and was now breathing rot, passing it on to everyone around him. One such note said, "Whoever touches his armor will begin to rot from within." By September, the people were no longer obedient. In the villages, people began to pray without priests. They burned images of former monarchs. One of the temples in Enna was destroyed. The remaining nobility demanded that Filippo abdicate. He did not come out to them. It was rumored that he no longer spoke, only moaned. In October, a rebellion broke out in Catania. It was led by a monk who called himself the purifier of the throne. He claimed to have seen Roger's body at the bottom of a cistern, breathing but without eyes. The uprising lasted 2 days. Filippo's troops burned the monastery and buried all the monks alive. At the same time, one of the remaining pages committed suicide, leaving a clear inscription on the wall. "I saw his face. It was mine." His body began to decompose within a day, despite the autumn cold. Officially, Philip died at the end of November. In the morning, he was found in his own bedroom, with torn bandages on his face and an iron helmet on his head. Servants claimed that they could not enter until noon, because the door was locked from the inside. The body was black, with signs of self-mutilation. There was no funeral. The body was burned in the garden, in the open air. The priest refused to consecrate the place, saying, "There is no soul in these ashes." After his death, anarchy broke out on the island. Each city proclaimed its own rule. The papal throne appointed a temporary governor, but his ship sank. Sicily fell apart. A year later, a monk hermit from Calabria wrote in his manuscript, "Where the face rots, the throne rots." Historians would later call this the curse of the faceless throne. By the end of the century, Sicily had not recovered. Everyone who wore the crown died alone. The last was Duke Arno, hanged by his own son. His will contained only one sentence: "Do not open the helmet."